Before I begin, I would like to thank the Jenks and the Cummings Foundation for being co-sponsors of this presentation. Herman Dudley Murphy, Unity of Beauty, Art and Frame, and it is being presented by John McConnell. John earned a BA in American Literature from Michigan State and a Master of Architecture degree from Harvard. In 1987, he was a founding principal of McConnell and Partners Architects, specializing in residential and small-scale institutional and commercial design. He has also been an adjunct professor of American architectural history at Boston College, a lecturer at the Harvard Architectural School, and a lecturer in residence at the MFA and other private and institutional groups. Since 1990, he has devoted himself to fine art, specializing in traditional landscape paintings in oil. These can be seen at his website, www.johnmcconnellartist.com. And locally, he has served on the board of directors of the Griffin Museum, the Jumelage Organization, and the Winchester Historical Society. So, John, will you introduce us to Herman Dudley Murphy?
Happy to, as much as I can. And I'm going to rely on the fact that there are probably 49 people watching this presentation who know more about this than I do. I can see one of you out there right now, Cynthia. And anyway, so what I've done, this is all comes from, in fact, from Lori Maniti, who noticed a news article from Lexington that said that Murphy's house there was in danger. And gee, wouldn't it be nice if through the Historical Society that we got to know a little bit more about him and maybe pique our interest in what's going on in Lexington in terms of historic preservation. So that's where this all came about. I admit to having heard of Murphy off and on, but not really knowing all that much about him. And so what I'm going to do here is essentially show you what I've learned so far. There's a lot more to know. I'm indebted to Cynthia Lawson-Samoilov a great deal for her help in bringing me up to date on a lot of this stuff. And also to Ellen Knight. I don't know if she's attending this lecture or not, but she's done an amazing amount of research over many years here into things Winchester, including things Murphy and things Samoilov. And so I've learned a lot from her as well. What I think I'll do now is simply start sharing the screen, and we'll just begin the presentation here. And then I'll go through it all and then take some questions or corrections at the end of the lecture. Okay, back to Murphy. He is someone that remained frequently in my go away thing. Anyway, let's move ahead here. I begin with this self-portrait in later years, but there's still red in his beard. His nickname was Red to his friends. He had red hair, and he is so well known as being everything other than being or in addition rather, to being an artist, that this lecture for me was a really interesting sort of thing. I start with a kind of gravitational center of Murphy himself, and then there's this amazing series of centrifugal forces coming off of all of this, spinning out into all kinds of interesting things having to do with Winchester's history. So I begin simply with this portrait of him to reinforce the fact that he was first and foremost a painter, among the many other things that I will show you tonight. And here's his monogram that he put on many of his paintings here, with a little kind of stylized M in the middle of either a circle or a couple of parentheses and a couple of dots on either side here. And so those show up frequently in his paintings. He was born in Marlborough, Massachusetts, of all places, and that's because his parents were established there. His father was born in Ireland, and his mother was a Yankee from New Hampshire. His father was in the shoe manufacturing industry, and so that's why they were in Marlborough in the first place. Only a few years later, they moved to New Jersey, were there for only a couple of years, and then moved back because a larger shoe factory was being established by the company in Stoneham nearby. And that brought him into the orbit of Winchester here. So here's a photograph of downtown Marlborough around the turn of the 20th century, a few decades after Murphy was born there, but it must have looked pretty similar to that with streetcars and horse-drawn buggies. After they returned to Greater Boston, he was sent to school for elementary and high school into Boston to the Chauncey Hall School, which shows up in this old photograph on the lower right here. This is the first church in Boston. It looks like a bullfinch or a Benjamin design. And this is the Chauncey Hall School beside it, which was associated with the school, or with the church rather. And in fact, the school and the street that it's on are named for one of the principal ministers in the church, whose name was Chauncey. Anyway, and the photograph is of the graduating class of that school about 4 years after Murphy left there. So his school picture probably would have looked just like that. Now, following that, he made up his mind that he wanted to study art. And every good father who's ever had a son who wanted to study art said, well, okay, but I really don't want you doing that. But if you're determined, you must earn the money to do it and go to art school. And that's precisely what he did, and studied for a couple of years at the pretty much brand new school of the Museum of Fine Arts, which at that point was at Copley Square, in the building seen here that sits where the Copley Plaza Hotel now is. And the school was in the basement of that building. A number of young up-and-coming artists were instructors there who went on to become quite well known and form the core of what becomes known as the Boston School of Painters, including Joseph de Camp, who lived and had his main studio just down the street from here in Medford, along Winthrop Street, and Edmund Tarbell, who was perhaps the most successful and well-known of the group. And in fact, Murphy fell into his circle and became known as a Tarbellite, which is what all his pupils were known as, and began thinking about painting in terms of the Boston School. These guys, here are paintings by the two of them that are typical of much of their work, which depicts usually women in interiors, frequently with light coming in from a window somewhere, usually in some kind of pose of reverie or relaxation, and not infrequently with some kind of Asian-inspired background, particularly as we see in the Tarbell here, which is a famous painting in the collection of the MFA. In fact, both of these are. So this is sort of the basic training that he had. One of his classmates, both men and women were allowed in the museum school. And one of his classmates was a young woman named Nellie Littlehale, who was a watercolorist. More about her later. On the strength of his training, he was convinced that art was in fact his future. And any serious American who wanted to pursue that as a career usually tried to make his or her way to Paris, which was the center of the art world in the second half of the 19th century. Foreign students found it quite difficult to enroll in the major art school there, which was the École Nationale des Beaux-Arts. But a number of the professors there also started a school on the side, a private school that invited foreign students, and the lion's share of whom were Americans. This is a school called the Académie Julian. It's still there today. It's a building that straddles one of the famous passages of Paris, the kind of skylit covered streets that are like interior malls here. So there was a great deal of skylighting in the studios. We see a peek down below in the lower left into one of those studios. This is a painting by classmate of Murphy's named Jefferson Davis Chalfont, who has pictured himself in the lower right of that painting. The painting tells us something about the school. The emphasis for the first couple of years of instruction there was on painting from life, from nude models. And there were women in the school as well, but they were segregated from the men. They had separate life classes and all of that. So, and the principal teacher that Murphy had here is the guy that is pictured here, Jean-Joseph Benjamin Constant, who is one of the major forces in this school. And so we have several of these wonderful life studies that Murphy did while he was in school there. That was, it's indicative of the fact that he was extremely talented and could draw like a bandit. He had a wonderful eye and saw realistic here in these beautiful figures. He was 6'4" tall. He was an immensely tall guy and was an imposing figure in the school when he was dressed in his ordinary clothes, but even more imposing when there would be from time to time some sort of costume ball held by the students. And here's a photograph of him dressed as, and I don't know what this is, maybe an Inca or some sort of Central American native here with a huge peacock feather headdress and this ceremonial sword and all of that. The painting here is one of his fellow students here, a woman named Caroline Bowles, whom he, while they were in school there, ended up marrying. And this is a life study that he did of her, for which she was happy to pose. One of his major influences that had nothing to do with the school, but was all the rage of art talk in Paris and London, was the influence of James Abbott McNeill Whistler. You probably all know something about Whistler. He became incredibly famous in part for having a flamboyant personality, quite apart from his phenomenal and revolutionary art. Whistler was not an Englishman or a Parisian. He actually was born in Lowell, Massachusetts, and famously said later on that a man ought to be able to decide where he was born, and I choose not to be born in Lowell, Massachusetts. So anyway, his paintings tended to be either portraits or landscapes, and his most famous portrait is, of course, of his mother, and it's not labeled as a portrait of his mother, but rather an arrangement in blue and gray or something like this, called by its colors. He was a tonalist, what comes to be known as a tonalist. And by that, I mean that his emphasis was on creating paintings that were more than educational, they were beautiful. That was the first qualification for it. And one of the ways in which he made art for its own sake was by limiting the palette of colors that would appear in his paintings, so that there would be in any one of them a color that overall is suffused into every other color and tends to make a dominant tonal impression, a kind of poem of color out of all these paintings. The portrait here is mostly whites, an exercise in whites, except for the portrait is his girlfriend, Jo Heffernan, who had flaming red hair. And which is the only other color that really is here is picked up in the bearskin rug. The landscape is typical of much of his painting, which is gauzy, usually seen through mist or on a cloudy day, or at the beginning or the end of the day when there is the colors drain into a certain kind of limited tonality. And that's what really appealed to him. It appealed also to Murphy a great deal. And the other fact of Whistler that appealed to Murphy, there was a revelation to him, was that Whistler started to make his own frames for his paintings. Here are a couple Whistler frames, one with a painting in it showing obvious Japanese influence. And the frames are quite beautiful. They tended to be gilded and carved by hand in one way or another. And this was a great revelation, as I said, to Murphy, and something that becomes a big deal in his life. So he and Caroline returned from Paris after a couple of years of traipsing around the continent, particularly in Venice and northern Italy, and eventually end up in this neck of the woods. And in 1903, commission a house from the local Winchester famous architect Robert Coit, shown here. And I have been had the privilege of being given a set of the original blueprints for the house that's still very much here, much altered from this time. But here are the first floor plan in the upper left and the basement plan below that. And he and Coit became lifelong friends and collaborated over the entirety of their careers. Coit ended up dying just 3 years before Murphy did. So here's the what was called the front elevation of this house, which is on Highland Avenue, but you can't see it because it's up on a cliff. And the front of the house is the front that faces away from Highland Avenue, faces east toward the Middlesex Fells. You can tell a little bit from the blueprint here that the right-hand end of the house is seen in this old early photograph of it is different from the design. The roof started here and went up this way instead. So this was apparently a sleeping porch or something of some kind that didn't get built. There is now a huge addition on this end of the house, so that whole end has been obliterated by that. And this is the other facade, the facade that faces west towards Highland Avenue and the setting sun up there on its hill. And of course, the house grew like topsy over many years here, to the extent that to the left-hand side of this blueprint was a series of buildings, a connector piece, and then his painting studio, which we see here on the lower left, all connected into the main house. But so a lot of this upper stuff, this entire piece of this of the house is new. This is the connector piece. This white piece is new, and then down here, all the white stuff on this side of the studio is also later additions to the house. At some point, the house became divided after Murphy left the house, became divided between house and studio. And so there are to this very day, are two separate pieces of real estate with two separate owners, both of whom I have now had the great fortune of meeting. Here is technically the front as it's seen today, where the circular drive brings you up to the main front door of the connector piece that leads you into the studio half of things. The upper level is later addition, and all of this stuff is later as well. But here are some of the details of this as these pieces were added onto the house over the years, with these kind of OG Gothic arched windows that come directly from Venice, and the lion's heads and Venetian columns here, that sort of thing. And on the back side of the house is the connector piece has this series of a little kind of Venetian garden here with Gothic windows above and below. So here's a picture of the interior with an old photograph that was, I think, after Murphy left the house. This was when his daughter was living in the studio. But it shows that it's different from the way it looks today. This is a contemporary photograph here that has a kind of gallery built in on some columns here. And the far end, which is part of the original building here, has this wonderful glass corner and fireplace and an ingle nook, a big bench built in here that screens the stairs that went up to what was probably originally Murphy's office on this upper level above the fireplace here. But there was a railing there that may or may not have been open at some point. And then what we see is on the north side of the building, there are these large windows that, as an artist studio should be, is bathed in light from the north, which is, of course, shadowless light. The sun, it never appears on that side of the building. So here's the detail of the way we see this ingle nook now, a wonderful built-in bench where you could sit with a book and sit by the fire, or with friends and talk about art. And undoubtedly that's what went on here, as ensuing generations living here brought all kinds of interesting and famous people into this house. We'll talk about that in a few minutes here. So here's how you see it from the street today, up on this great hill, with these amazing stone walls all along the edge of the property here. You just can get a peek of the studio and its additions down on the north side here. But as you rise along, the land rises to a point where you can't really even see the house. All of these amazing stone walls have been built here. This one is a set of stairs that is dug into the hillside and that eventually turns and rises up through a tunnel and emerges in the backyard of the house. And that's all still there today. Because the house was on a hillside, and a rocky one at that, Murphy decided to name it for his father's birthplace, which is a little town 4 miles to the west of the city of Cork in Ireland. And the town is called, and I put the Irish here, is called Corrigrohan, which became, as you anglicize it, becomes Carrigrohan. And that was the name of now his house. And that's an important point to make, because in the basement of that house, when it was brand new, starting in 1903, Murphy decided to begin making his own frames. The frames that were commercially available in his day were, in his estimation, unsatisfactory for his art, which was, as we will see later on, somewhat modestly avant-garde. It was Whistlerian and tonal and all of that. It wasn't literally representational of the subjects generally that he chose to paint. So he looked to the burgeoning kind of arts and crafts movement that was sweeping the country at the time. This emphasis on getting away from shoddy, mass-produced, industrialized goods and returning back to the idea of talented craftspeople making things by hand, and therefore they would be more beautiful. And the designs were simplified. So I'm showing you one of these early Carrigrohan frames that Murphy made, gilded with a couple of different textures here, very beautiful, with a limited amount of carvings generally at the corners, and all of that. And the point here in Murphy's mind was to make frames that became sort of unified in a sense of beauty with the paintings that they were intended to enclose. And each one was different. It was made specifically for paintings. I will now show you a bunch of these, but most of them are now available online without the paintings that they originally enclosed. And so I'll show you a few that do. These are typical of the frames of Murphy's day. They tended to be more or less French and more or less Baroque, with all this curvy stuff kind of over the top that would tend to almost overwhelm whatever was being shown, whether it was a painting or a mirror with your or my face in it, looking through this, Louis XIV grillage of gold here. And so, in fact, in the upper left here, this is actually a Murphy painting, a Murphy landscape, shown in what has to be a kind of an inappropriate frame for that painting at some point. It's not a Carrigrohan frame. So, but here is one, and this is extremely beautiful. There's almost, again, a kind of Japanese sense of all of this, minimal with just the right amount of ornament. These wonderful little, just dark incised marks here, top and bottom, and the whole thing is really exquisite. And all of these frames on the back would be dated and with Murphy's little cartouche, his little logo here, and the name of the shop on them. Now, early on, right from the almost beginning, here's a drawing and then a frame that was more or less produced by that drawing. The drawing was produced by this guy. This is a friend of Murphy's named Charles Prendergast. And Prendergast was quite a craftsman, and he dedicated himself, along with Murphy, to the creation of these frames. The two of them formed the Carrigrohan frame shop. that within a matter of just 3 years became incredibly well known. Later in life, Prendergast became, as his more famous brother had always been, an artist. But his art involved painting hand-carved wooden plaques, and we see one of those here in this kind of pseudo-naive, kind of childlike fairy tale way of doing things, and then decorated by hand with little figures and figurines and that sort of thing. Charles and his much more famous brother, Maurice Brazel Prendergast, were born in St. John's in Newfoundland, and were brought as young children by their parents to Boston for mostly business reasons. And as young adults, they ended up both studying art and somehow, and I don't know how this happened, migrating to Winchester. The two of them lived in a little cottage on Walnut Street, just 2 blocks up from where Murphy built his house. And so that's how they kind of knew one another through that association of art and all of that, and frames. And here are just 3 paintings that represent much of Prendergast, of Maurice Prendergast's art. He becomes fairly well known here. He is invited to show art as an American in the very famous Armory show in New York of 1913, which was the stunning shocker of an art show that introduced Americans to abstract modern European art. The fame of Fernand Léger's painting Nude Descending a Staircase was one of the sensations of that show. And Murphy showed several paintings also in the Armory show, but thereafter was more or less turned off to European modernism and continued to do art that was more or less tonal and representational, as we will see when I finally get around to showing you his actual paintings. So here are just a few more of these Carried Rohan frames. Extremely beautiful. The one in the lower left is a detail of the little needle stippling that was done by hand here, making these little patterns in the gold. Couple more. We don't know if I don't know whether this one on the left actually originally enclosed a mirror or a painting. The one on the right certainly enclosed a painting, and the little floral designs worked into the border must have had something to do with whatever the Maycomber painting that originally was in this frame. We don't know what it was. A couple more of these things. All sorts of different styles. Both Murphy and Prendergast really started afresh with every commission here and came up with kind of new designs for these things. To put these frames in context, they were, even in their very day, stunningly expensive things. To give you an example, most of these frames went for an average of about $25 a piece. And this is in the same time that if you went to Loch Ober for a delicious dinner, you would pay about $1 for that dinner. So the frames were $25, 25 dinners at Loch Ober. And today, they're still staggeringly expensive. They've become incredibly famous, and they are collector's items. So here are a couple with the original paintings in them. They were both Boston School painters. On the right is Murphy's original teacher. No, I'm sorry, I take that back. This is Frank Benson, not Tarbell, another famous teacher at the MFA school. And then the incredibly elaborate, beautiful frame on the left here was done for this famous painting by Childe Hassam, another Bostonian who goes on to be a significant figure in the history of art. Here's a Murphy frame with a Murphy painting still in it. This is a beautiful, tiny little landscape depicting Mount Monadnock in winter time and probably late in the day on a cloudy day, so that there's not a lot of sunlight here. It's this gauzy purple and blue, lovely little tonal thing set in a frame that, while considerably larger, doesn't really overwhelm the painting. It really complements it. Or another Murphy painting, another one of these gauzy tonalist seascapes. He did any number of seascapes, and I'll show you some. but here's a frame that he concocted by hand specifically for this painting. So here's the back at the house. This is both paintings by Murphy, a self-portrait showing that he had red hair here as a young man, and then his bride, Caroline Bowles Murphy. This is the point at which they decide to divorce. So it's 1916 that he divorces Caroline, and he ends up marrying again in that same year. But they, in the meantime, produced 2 children who were raised in that house. More of them in just a second. While they're living together in the house, Murphy is taking all kinds of teaching jobs on. And one of them is pretty interesting. He was invited for 3 summers to teach summer school out in Woodstock, New York, at this brand new thing called the Birdcliff Summer School of Art. That continues on to this very day. It's still very much there, and was a major, not just painting, but craft, arts and crafts school that was established by these 2 guys, Ralph Radcliffe Whitehead. It's named for part of his middle name, and then Ruth Bird, his wife. So Birdcliff comes from their two names. And then mostly a writer, a young guy named Hervey White. Hervey White is the original hippie. He ends up spending most of his life there, and after only a few years, splits off from Birdcliff and founds his own art school. That in addition to being an art school, he started back in 1910 an annual summer music festival that was a big draw there in Woodstock, and which continues on to our very day, and of course produced after White's death the famous Woodstock Music Festival of all of our youth here. So I don't know if there's anybody in the audience who actually claims to have gone to Woodstock in 1960, when, 9 or 8, I can't remember now. But anyway, these are the guys that started all of that. So they induced Murphy to come out there and teach. And here's a view inside one of the barns or the studios with these wonderful north-facing skylights, in which Murphy taught and then also produced furniture and frames and paintings on his own. This is a chest of drawers that he made, that he decorated. The panels of these chests that were produced at Birdcliff had all the local artists doing paintings on the cover. And what he chose to depict here was, in 2 hunks, is probably Essex or Ipswich or something like that, a North Shore marsh with one of these tidal rivers kind of winding its way through. At the same time, he began, actually even earlier than that, in 1899, teaching at Harvard. And interestingly, teaching in the architecture school at Harvard. Harvard was one of the earliest, I think number 4 or 5 in the country, universities to establish a school of architecture. The first was MIT in 1866. So here's the architecture school at Harvard was in these 2 buildings initially when Murphy was teaching there. The lower one in color is Robinson Hall by the very famous New York architects McKim, Mead, and White, who did incredible numbers of buildings in Boston as well. And then up above that building, you can see its roof here in this upper photograph. Behind it was the original Fogg Art Museum by another famous architect in New York, Richard Morris Hunt, which became, after the Fogg moved to bigger quarters across the street, became the studio building for the architecture school. And that was in use right up until 1972, when I showed up to be a student there. And Hunt Hall had just been demolished because the brand new Gund Hall was being opened in 1972. So, but Murphy taught there for almost 40 years, long time, towards the end of which he also then had a teaching position in the Harvard School of Art as well. So he was teaching drawing mostly, I think, to architecture students, and then painting in the art school. He also, for 4 years, was teaching at the Worcester Art Museum. And I'm not sure at the turn of the century how you got back and forth to Worcester, if you did it on the train or I don't think it was sort of early on for somebody to have a car to drive all the way out there. But anyway, he did. He helped to revolutionize Winchester. He participated in and indeed was the founding member of some of the institutions in town that came into being in the early decades of the 20th century here. He was a founding member, together with Robert Coit, the architect, of the Winchester Boat Club. Murphy spent his entire life as a great devotee of sailing, particularly canoeing, and canoeing in canoes that had sails on them. So he would go all over the place, and was a fond charter member of the Winchester Boat Club. He also founded in 1906, based on a Bostonian model, the Winchester Handicrafts Society, which unfortunately no longer exists, but many towns of any significance across the entire country had arts and crafts societies where people would get together in evenings and weekends and do crafty things, make pottery or paint or make frames or furniture or something like that. He missed by just 1 year being a charter member of Winchester's Monday Club, of which both I and Kilmer are members, that has a continuous existence from 1904. Murphy was the first member to join in 1905. So there's an unbroken archives going all the way back to that time of all the interesting lectures and presentations that members have given one another in that very interesting club. He was a member of the National Academy of Design. He was incorporated as a full member in the early 1930s. He was a member of the famous art club in Boston, the St. Botolph Club, of which I am proud to be a member. And then the even more famous Salmagundi Club in New York, which is one of the oldest art institutions in the city of New York. So I mentioned his children. They had two children, a daughter and a son. The son born first, and then 2 years later, 2.5 years later, their daughter, Carlene. And both of them go on to be tornadoes of creativity in the world of art and a larger world of art here. Dudley, seen here, just the two of them, I think, in the middle in high school. Dudley goes ultimately traipsing around Europe and then ends up in California, back and forth between the two, and becomes a very famous movie director. Early in his career, as still a young man, he links up in Europe with some very avant-garde people, particularly Fernand Léger in France, and an American who becomes a European, Man Ray, a very famous pioneer in the field of photography and film. And the three of them make a real blockbuster of a film. It's a 19-minute silent film made in 1923 called Ballet Mécanique, Mechanical Ballet. And it's a silent film. I had the privilege of seeing it at Christmas down in Richmond, Virginia, which had mounted back then an enormous show all about Man Ray and his photography. And there was a separate little room where you went into and you got to see the film that ran continuously, together with a soundtrack that was created for it by a French composer. And so anyway, and it was really blockbuster. It's highly psychedelic. You feel like you've been eating mushrooms or something when you sit through this film more than once. Anyway, so that was Dudley's career, and then of course ended up in Hollywood working for a couple of the great film houses out there, and made some fairly well-known films with very famous actors and actresses. Carlene, on the other hand, while she did her share of traipsing around Europe throughout her life, remained in Winchester, and particularly after her parents divorced, she's the one who got the house, and she established herself there, and then became a force to reckon with in the field of art, but mostly dance and theater forms of art in Winchester and beyond. while she was in Europe, she fell in, she was the only American actually to fall in with a really interesting theatrical troupe that did dance and other sorts of staged presentations that were Russians. It was Stanislavski's Moscow Art Theater, and she became a part of that troupe, contributing costume and set design and occasionally appearing on stage and all of that. And later, when she came back to Winchester, still stayed in touch with Stanislavski, and who was then conducting in 1922 a tour of the United States, including Boston. And so naturally, she went down and said hello, and they pressed her into service on stage. And in doing so, she met this dapper young Russian emigre who, with his parents and twin brother, had fled the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And he ended up as an engineering student at Harvard. And so he was pressed into service as an extra in the productions that they mounted, and they met and fell in love, and a number of years later married. So here's a picture of Carlene with her husband, Alexander Samoilov. And most of you, many of you who, if you've lived in town for a long time, know of the Samoilovs. They have become important members through generations of Winchester society and its creative enterprises. She was a great advocate of dance, of art dancing. And she was a friend of a woman named Mary Kellogg, who I believe was located mostly in Boston, but was known for her artistic dancing. She created dancing for troops of dancers and all of that. And she was induced to come by Carlene to Winchester in 1911 and 1912 to stage a series of dances at, of all places, Sanborn House. And down below are some of the scenes of dances that she organized. The one up above is her dancing a solo with this stuffed dove that was one of the props in one of her famous dances that is depicted down here in the lower right. This is Mary Kellogg and some of the younger people, and that must have included Carlene, who were dancers in a production of what she called Pandora's Box. And that's, we see both the casket here and in this painting by a local Italian-American architect who was a friend of Murphy's, a guy named Ettore Caser. And and here's that same dove that occurs in all of these images here. And of course, if you know the story of Pandora, she had a chest that she was induced to open, and all the evils of the world came out, at which point the lid was slammed shut. And it was only later that she was reluctantly induced to reopen the chest to see what was left. And what was left was peace. It was a dove. That was the countermeasure to all the evils of the world that had come out of Pandora. And of course, her name Pandora is Greek for all gifts. So here's Carlene. She loved riding a bike, among other things. She is known for several things, including giving what is widely regarded as the very first university level series of courses in acting, which was down the road at Tufts in 1940 and 1941. And then at the end of that decade, she was brought on as the director of the newly established Harvard Dramatic Club, and she sort of did the same sort of thing there. It wasn't a university course, but it was a club for students. And then in 1956, she established the Winchester Community Theater for adults and an arm of that for children, the School for Children of the WCT. The adult version of that only lasted a few years. It was not a roaring success. But the School for Children was and went on to be famous, not just in Winchester, but in Boston and environs. And she directed lots of productions all around Greater Boston. And of course, in a slightly different form, it continues on to this very day as a highly successful theatrical training ground for young children. I have friends here in town whose children are going on to careers in theater because of this institution in our midst. So during the time between the divorce in 1916 and Caroline and her children's return to Carrigrohan in 1922, the house was rented out to different people, including a family named Tufts, who were related to the people, to Charles Tufts, who founded the college and then the university here. And one of the kids that spent time in that house grew up to be a famous actor named Sonny Tufts. They later relocated just down to Stratford Road here off of Bacon Street. So Sonny is just one of the many fairly well-known Hollywood constellation of people that end up at Carrigrohan, that end up in this house here, mostly through Carlene and her brother and their association with film. And so I just have a poster of just 6 of the well-known people from the world of film who have been guests at the Highland Avenue home here, either staying there or being invited to dinner or that sort of thing, visiting. And I'll spare you reading the names. You can read them for yourselves. I'm assuming that most of us have heard of these people. I have, and I'm not incredibly aged yet. So anyway, but a kind of a who's who of Hollywood figures. So in 1916, Murphy and Nellie get married and move to Lexington. And it is that house that they built for themselves that they lived in for the rest of their lives. Murphy died in that house. And here's what it looks like today, or actually last week. And this is interesting because of Laurie Menides having discovered that there is a movement. This is up on a big hill. And the main drag of that hill is Summit Avenue. But there are a number of important houses up there architecturally and for other reasons that are all threatened with development. Some of this, apparently somebody's buying up these properties, including the Murphy House. And there has been now for about a year, a movement in Lexington of people living up there. If you go up there, you see lawn signs everywhere, to have this designated as the 4th historic district in the town of Lexington. The town meeting in Lexington debated the issue last fall and rejected it. And so I don't know where it stands. I don't know what they're continuing to try and advocate for saving all of this. But at this point, it's threatened. And perhaps there can be another presentation by Laurie or someone else on the ongoing effort here through maybe a relationship with the Lexington Historical Society. Anyway, I've been talking about an artist for a half an hour here, and I've never shown you much of his art, so that I will now make amends for having done that. Here's an early painting from just after his return from Europe, from Paris and Venice. And it's this kind of Whistler style, extreme stretched out horizontality to these canvases. He did a lot of those early on. And again, this is a depiction of a tidal march somewhere on the North Shore of Boston. You can see the tide is going out and there's just a little bit of water left in the tide flat there. And then down below, I show you, this is not from this painting, but from another one, his typical signature on most of his paintings, including this wonderful little logo or cartouche that he used in imitation of many other artists, including Whistler, who had a little kind of butterfly symbol as his way of signing paintings. This is interesting. I found only recently the study for this very large painting, and which doesn't have a name that identifies its location. It's called Landscape. And the study is known to art dealers simply as Moonrise. So we don't know if this is Europe or New England or California. It could be anywhere, one of those places. And it's an early one of the paintings that may have been done in the house on Highland Avenue. 1903 is the date of that house. So This is a more typical of Murphy, and it shows us an example of tonalism here. And of course, the frame is also a Murphy hand-carved frame as well. So lovely little landscape, almost entirely in a variance of gray. Every color here has gray in it. And the composition is beautiful, a little folds of landscape moving back through a series of plains to the shadowed Mount Monadnock beyond. We recognize its profile immediately. And then the wonderful little vertical of a tree that rises up out of the picture frame here that nails us into the foreground of the painting. Tonalism was very much an American thing, Whistler notwithstanding, even though he was an American, but it was mostly thought of by late 19th and early 20th century American painters as an antidote to Impressionism, which was all the rage coming from France and spreading through the world. And Impressionism tended to be a painting style of dots and spots of pure color used right from the tubes, placed side by side to cause the rods and cones in your eyes to vibrate and create the physiological effect that light has on your eyeballs as well, without recourse to shining a light into your eyes. We do vibratory color instead. And in many cases, the subject matter for Impressionist painting was different. It was urban life, life on the streets, train stations, people rowing boats, all that kind of stuff. Most tonalist paintings, particularly in America, don't generally tend to depict either urban life or even human beings. We have landscapes that are beautiful jewels of poems that are suffused through with a single color and tend to be self-consciously made just to be beautiful, not to depict a real place or to teach or to do any of that kind of stuff, but just to be luscious and beautiful. So here are two famous American painters who worked in this style. Dwight Tryon down in Padenham on the south shore of Massachusetts did a typical, this is typical of his landscape, a field in the foreground, a screen of trees, and a time of day that's usually early dawn or late at night, and frequently not the middle of summer or the dead of winter, but usually spring or fall when the earth is softer. And then John Twachtman, the very famous painter who becomes eventually an Impressionist, painting in France. This is a very well-known early painting of his, of just a pure, beautiful landscape that's gray-green. So here's another Tryon down below, a screen of trees behind a field with a moonrise happening. And then a painting here in Boston by Monet early on. We also have a painting by Sargent painting Monet and his wife while he's actually painting this painting. So I love the sort of picture within a picture here. But it's a field in Giverny, again, a screen of trees and everything. But the painting technique is totally different from Tryon, with its much more broken color and the juxtaposition of pinks, yellows, blues, and greens all together in the field there to create the effect of dappled sunlight. So back to Murphy, I show you again this beautiful little Mount Monadnock together with another kind of fall poem, if you will, that's mostly warm grays and yellows here, a New England hillside in the autumn. It's out of focus, but this beautiful moon landscape here of a clouded sky with the moon shining through the thin clouds up above. Or a beautiful early spring pasture where the yellows are in both the greens below and the sky above. Tree studies in the summer and fall, the same sort of thing. These are a little bit less tonal, but nonetheless very beautiful. Murphy did a lot of, in the earlier parts of his career, a lot of plein air paintings, painting out of doors. Both in good weather and bad. I'll show you winter paintings that he did out of doors. Here's a picture of him, although this is later in life, still continuing to paint on plein air. Here's a beautiful tonalist nocturne by Murphy. I like to believe this is Winchester, and it's a picture of the boat club, with its lights on across the way there. Not only did he and Coit found the boat club, but Coit designed the clubhouse. Lots of seascapes by Murphy. These are 3 of them with bolder color, beautiful stuff. And many of his seascapes have low horizons, which means that they're more about the sky than anything else. And of course, at the sea, that's where you can get the most distant horizon that an artist can ever take advantage of. So there's a sunset, which is much more broadly colored than most of Murphy's ocean paintings. The other 2 are much more typical of clouds, whether they be mostly rose and orange colored, or the beautiful pinks down below with lovely dark waves coming in. Here are 3 more. Rocky Islands, a wave study, and then the bathers on the beach, reminiscent of a contemporary of his named Edward Pothast, whose whole fame is known for painting people on the beach. This looks for all the world like Good Harbor Beach in Gloucester to me because of its 2 levels with the tide flats, the tide going out here. A couple more. Day and night, this basically the same landscape. And the beauty of just of somewhere up where we can't see it is probably the moon or a very bright star that's causing these reflections on the water and on wet sand. A couple of wave studies. This is exquisitely beautiful. The one on the lower right has just the wonderful little hint of sails on the horizon there that are the same color as the wave itself. And then there's his non-tonalist work, a lot of it landscapes, a lot of them coming from travels. He and both his wives traveled extensively, particularly around the Caribbean and Central America, but also in Europe. And so up above we have plein air sketches probably from both of those places. He would make sketches and then in some cases bring them back to the studio at the end of the holiday and work over them. The upper right is in Mexico, a viaduct going across a valley here. The one on the upper left is in the south of Italy. It's an Italian hill town with a beautiful church rising up. And down below is a corner of the famous El Morro Castle, which is in San Juan, Puerto Rico. The painting of the little turret on the left-hand side was known to me, and I had the great delight of discovering just a couple of days ago this beautiful etching that he made from that painting extended. And of course, it's reversed because when you print an etching, everything gets backwards. So, a sketch and a finished painting from his sojourns in Venice. He loved Venice, and we have lots and lots of work from there. I'll show you a few of these. I think the painting on the left, which is called Rio del Paradiso, is one of the most beautiful paintings of Venice that I've ever seen. Here are a couple more in frames that Murphy made himself. Many of his Venice paintings are like his ocean scenes where the foreground is water and whatever the background is almost completely flat across the back, not seen in acute perspective in any way. A couple more, much more tonalist versions of Venice. The upper left is the island of San Giorgio Maggiore seen across the lagoon. And the lower one is this beautiful nocturne taken of a gondolier crossing the lagoon with the lights of the city beyond. And it's highly reminiscent of his hero, Whistler. Who did a whole series of these watery nocturnes, most of them in London. But here we see something that's sort of an equivalent to what Murphy's doing at the same time. Here's a study and then the finished painting for one of the numerous paintings of Mount Monadnock that he made. I particularly like this, the finished painting here. It does what every good landscape painting should do, which is lead your eye, give your eye a path to traverse way back in from the very foreground to the very distant part of the painting here. A couple of plein air paintings in the wintertime. These are up in the mountains somewhere, either out in Massachusetts or up in New Hampshire, I'm assuming. Snow scenes. I love the dark fir trees on the left, the way that the shadows are roughly painted in and the beautiful cerulean blue on the snow there. Tree studies, he did lots and lots of those. Here just a couple. In the upper left, an old apple tree in a rocky New England field here just at the beginning of spring. And down below, one of these ocean blasted cypress trees that's in Monterey, out in California. Thank you, Betsy Spiller, for that. He was quite a portraitist. And my big disappointment in all of this is that apparently the Museum of Fine Arts is in chaos enough that they don't answer their emails or their phone call requests for some of images of something in their collection. Here's a self-portrait that is in the MFA, although seldom on view, but only known online in black and white. And I tried desperately, will continue to do so, to get the colored version of it, but I have to show you it, unfortunately, in black and white here. And then a very, very early portrait of him, probably from Europe, portrait of a gentleman that's in bad shape. It has what the French call craquelure, this crackly effect. There are ways of fixing that with the application of oils and stuff like that. But anyway, so here are a couple typical Murphy portraits. They're formal, as you would expect, and they're more typical of Boston school portraiture that he would have learned from his teachers and then seen ever thereafter. He was a member of the famous Boston Art Club, and so he would be seeing on a weekly or monthly basis what was going on in the Boston art scene. And a lot of it was portraiture. Couple more beautiful ones. The one on the right is his first wife, Caroline Bowles Murphy. Thank you, Cynthia, for that. And then he was the center of a whole extended network of fellow artists, many of whom went on to be quite well known. And they painted each other. And so here are four of his portraits of four of his artist friends here. The big one is probably the best of the lot in terms of art, is Henry Ossawa Tanner, who was a classmate of Murphy's in Paris at the Académie Julian at the same time. Tanner was an African-American who was born in Pittsburgh, and after having figured out that he had no stomach for putting up with racial animosity, moved to France and spent most of his life there. Traveled extensively throughout Europe and the Holy Land, and has a vast number of paintings of biblical scenes and landscapes. Probably the most well-known is his Annunciation to Mary, where the archangel is just a shaft of light rather than a person standing in front of a terrified teenage girl. So here's his portrait of Tanner, which is pretty well known. We see his little symbol right there on the portrait. And these others, Dawson Wasson went on to be a famous American, although British-born, American impressionist in the American colony at Giverny. And he lived for a year and a half just up the street from Murphy here in Winchester. Charles Curtis Allen was a New Hampshireite, I think, and is famous for his mountainscapes more than anything else. And Charles Woodbury did the same thing for the sea. He was mostly a marine painter and established the famous a school of art in Ogunquit. And so he's well known for that. I have a little wave study here at home by Woodbury that I like. Another one of his friends who actually lived here in Winchester is this guy, Garrett Benneker, who was born in Grand Rapids but made his way east, became mostly well known by being an early founder of the Cape Cod School of Art in Provincetown, and ended up with his wife having a cottage in Truro and living up there. But they lived in Winchester, and courtesy of Ellen Knight, she found a quotation of his from 1932 while living in Winchester. And he said, of all the suburbs about Boston, why did we prefer Winchester to other places in which to live? Aside from the friendships we made, the comfortable homes we lived in, the good schools which were the privilege for our children to attend, we felt that Winchester is a town where civic pride is evident at every turn. There were no quote unquote movies, no billboards to influence the emotions of the young. The streets, the parks, the homes were all well cared for. And he goes on and on. But, so it's a sort of a paean of love for Winchester. And if you have a nice house down in Truro and a house in Winchester, you're doing pretty well here. He was famous during World War I for being commissioned by the American government to paint patriotic posters for the war effort here. And so he painted hundreds and hundreds of working men and women. The work of ordinary people really appealed to him, and many of these have gone on to be quite famous. He also painted luscious landscapes, and here are two of his Cape Cod landscapes in Murphy frames. One of his mentees here in Boston, or Boston and around, and eventually in Winchester, was the Italian who became an American named Ettore Casser, who is buried nearby here, Murphy, in Wildwood Cemetery. And if you know nothing else about him, you will know by going to the library that he painted these two paintings that are in the meeting room there, a self-portrait, and then this painting of Bible reading in a Puritan home. And then last but not least, Aidan LaSalle Ripley, who was a Lexington artist, a good friend of Murphy's. Here's his self-portrait. And if you know nothing else about him, you know the great mural in the library up above the checkout desk here of the purchase of land from the Indians. I had to include this. Down below is a watercolor that he did called Snow at Easter, of people going to church. And then I just took this little photograph of the exact same spot. It's St. Charles Borromeo Church and School and Rectory just up in Woburn Center here. So the exact same thing. So we end up with Murphy late in his career. He did more than anything else, he did still lives, and particularly floral still lives. So I'll end by showing you a bunch of those. Many of them have an Asian flavor to them, mostly Japanese. Here are two still lives, very beautiful and simple. Basically, each of them with just a trio of objects in them. And in this case, the same little vase or sake pitcher or whatever that is occurs in both of them. Gorgeous compositions set into these incredibly beautiful Murphy frames. And then I'll just show you these without commenting much. A lot of these beautiful floral compositions that he did. You can find all these online if you want to look at them longer. A trio of hot ones with hot colors here. Most of them have backgrounds that are Japanese in one way or another. This may be the lingering, long-lasting influence of Whistler here. So I end with, here's a portrait of him later in life, and with his burial place just across the street from me here in Wildwood Cemetery. If you go in through the main gates, you bear left twice, and then on your right is a big rocky cliff. So that from Carrig Rohan to the rocky cliff of Wildwood Cemetery, he spent most of his life living up on mountains and cliffs here. You can't see much of it from the road, but what you can see down here and below is a staircase and a handrail that leads you up into there. So this is the sort of family plot, and there's a sort of an extended family buried there. And up behind these bushes is the rock that you see at the top of the screen here, where both of his wives and he himself and his children and others, his parents, are all buried. But it's interesting that to keep the wives separate, they're on two different faces of this rock. So here are the plaques they're on. On the left-hand side, it's his first wife, Caroline. And both of their children, Dudley and Carleen, are buried there. And Carleen's husband, Alexander, is there, and various other family members. Caroline's father is there. And then on the other side is Murphy himself. He's listed down at the bottom with his second wife, Nellie, and then various members, his parents, and I think a cousin in the family. And then this wonderful quotation that I reproduce here for you, together with Aidan Lascelles Ripley's sketch portrait of him, which is, I think, maybe my favorite of all of the depictions of his face. I like this one the best, with looking straight out with a penetrating gaze, and yet at ease at the same time. So the quotation comes from The Pilgrim's Progress of 1678 by John Bunyan, and it's a beautiful thing to have on a tomb. So that's the end of the presentation. I can shut this off now if I can figure out how to do that. There we go. So now I don't know how to close this.
I think you're good.
Yeah. Okay.
So we do have a question in the chat. I also have one.
Maybe I can't see it, so maybe you could read it for me.
Yeah, I can read it for you. Did he have any affiliation to the Winchester Country Club that you are aware of?
Not that I know of, but perhaps someone who is on here, maybe Cynthia, if she knows the answer, she could unmute and say that. I wouldn't be surprised. He was a member of everything. The Monday Club, of which he was a member, was started the year before he joined by the Reverend John Suter at the Parish of the Epiphany, and who was also a charter member of the Winchester Country Club. So they all knew one another, and I wouldn't be surprised. But I can't answer the question.
Okay, thank you. I had a question. It looked like he was quite prolific. Do you know whether or not he created frames for every piece? Or...
I don't know, and I would suspect he didn't. He didn't keep up personally with Karig Rohan. It was eventually, for 3 years, it was in the basement of his house. And then it became so popular that he moved it into Boston. And from 1905 to 1917, they hired additional craftspeople. So he managed it together with Prendergast, but was less involved in a hands-on way with running or with actual carving of things. And then it became even too much for them to do that. And in 1917, it was given over to Vaux, to the Vaux gallery, to run as an adjunct of Vaux. And they did that up until 1939, when after a decade of depression, there was there were fewer sales than could justify keeping it going. So the frame shop ended then. But Murphy, after 1917, was not involved in it in any way. But he continued to use their frames.
Beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful. Let's see, we have a couple more questions here. Wow, they came in. Hold on a second. The presentation was so wonderful. Thank you. Let's see if that's so there's some, we'll send you the thank yous afterwards as well. How did you assemble all the content for this presentation?
Oh boy, most of it came from online. There's a lot out there about Murphy. If you Google him, a lot will come up. But a lot of it came from a few sources here in town, and I'm indebted, as I think I have said already, to Ellen Knight, particularly to Cynthia Lawson-Samoilov, and she married one of Samoilov's two sons, so she's a family member, and then Betsy Spiller also allowed me to come and see one of the Murphy paintings that she has, the pine in Monterey that's so beautiful. So I'm indebted mostly to them for helping me out in all of this. I'm exhausted. This took a lot of work.
That's a lot. Are there any questions from the audience? Is there a historic walk or a source of information on the historic folks from Winchester Cemetery?
I don't know of one. There ought to be one. But that wouldn't be up to me. The Historical Society might work with Wildwood Cemetery in order to create one. But yeah, there's all kinds of fascinating people up there.
Yes, so we have talked about it a few times
It's a
as
good
the
idea.
historicals. There's been a couple times where we've talked about doing something in October as a walking tour, which I think would be lovely.
Yeah, and not just famous people, but in some cases, just the graves and the tombs themselves are really interesting to look at.
Could I ask a question to John?
Oh, please do.
Yeah, this is Jane McDonald, and
Hi.
our first home in Winchester was on Walnut Street. And I noticed that you said the Prendergast lived on Walnut
Yeah.
Street. And I just wondered if anyone knew which house it was, because I had never heard that. It's a tiny street.
Yeah, I tried to find out and I couldn't figure it out, but it said a cottage. And there are only two houses that, in my mind, qualify as cottages that are still on Walnut Street. There's that, and I think they're both red and are side by side. There's the one that's a little kind of with Gothic. It has a front porch and little Gothic dormers on the front. It's a Carpenter Gothic house. So my suspicion is it was one of those two, but I don't know for a fact.
Well, ours was kind of cottagey also. We were at the very tippy top of Walnut Street on the right and backed up to Highland Avenue. And there was no space really for even a sidewalk. It was so close to Highland Avenue.
If you go to the town hall on days when the archives is open, Ellen Knight is usually there, or someone will be, and can answer that question. All you have to do is look in the voter records for those years from 1905, 1906,
Oh, okay.
And it'll tell.
I'll take that on as a little project. Thank you. This was delightful. And don't forget Art and Bloom is this weekend at the Museum of Fine Arts.
Flowers everywhere.
Electra, did you have a question?
I did. I was curious about the process. So here we have these gorgeous frames and they were being created, it sounded like almost for the piece of art that they were going to house. What would that process have been? Would an artist have brought the work and would it have been a collaborative process, or was it a lot more commercial than that? It's like they just made beautiful frames.
I think it was both of those at the same time. A commissioned frame, an artist would come and bring in the painting. Even today, if you go to a frame shop and commission a painting, you have to bring the painting in so that they see what you're framing and help you choose, a molding for it. But in many cases, because that was one of the dominant ideas behind Card Rohan, was that if it was a commissioned work, then it would be done specifically for that piece. Otherwise, people would say, I saw this. I saw this frame. It was design number 907, and I'd like one too. And then they would produce another one.
John, thank you very much. This is really lovely. I was not familiar with Murphy, and some of the paintings that you showed tonight were just absolutely beautiful. So thank you for the time that you took. And it was clearly the interest that you had in his paintings definitely came through in your presentation.
You're welcome. And now I've set up at least 10 more lectures of all these interesting spin-offs from this thing for the Historical Society to pursue in the next few years here.
Absolutely. And the thing that I could not help notice is the similarities of your own paintings to some of the Murphy pieces as well.
I adore tonalism. And so that's a lot of what I do is based on looking at all the tonalist artists.
Well, so thank you very much. And so this wraps up our spring, for the most part, lecture series. The next thing that we are doing is the Town Day trolleys. So please do come out to visit us. We will have both children's tours as well as adult tours, and we're still finalizing the specific tours. And we will also have a self-guided walking tour. So those will also be available at our booths, both in the town common as well as in the center of town. So I hope you're able to join us in either of those. Or if you can't come for a trolley, at least please come by and say hello to us. And with that, Thank you for joining us tonight and have a great evening.